Our next speaker is Mayuk Deb, and he will be presenting on TopoNets, artificial neural network models with brain-like topography.
Thanks for the intro. So, how is intelligence organized in the human brain? Let's look at the visual cortex first. So, the visual cortex is remarkably organized across different scales. For example, in the early visual cortex, we have organization at the micro scale for things like orientations, blobs for color, etc. And by the mid to late stages, we observe that at a meso scale, there are clusters responding selectively to categories like faces, bodies, scenes, text, etc. Even at the macro scale, we see organizational biases for object size, animacy, retinotopy, and so on. So it's fair to say that the organization of the visual cortex is topographic, which means that nearby regions respond to similar things. And this kind of organization is not just restricted to the visual cortex, by the way. For example, in the auditory cortex, there is similar kind of organization that is observed. Like in the primary auditory cortex, there are maps for different frequencies or tonotopy, and in the non-primary auditory cortex, there is increasing evidence for regions selective to stimuli like speech, music, and even song. Beyond the sensory cortex, even in the language system, there is some evidence of organization by temporal receptive fields. What that means is that there are neural clusters that integrate information over single sentences or words. So, to summarize, many parts of the brain show stereotypical organization. And a question that we can now ask is, how is intelligence organized in current AI systems, which are increasingly being thought of as models of the human brain? We see a very different picture here. So there are broadly two species of AI models out there, convolutional neural nets and transformers. And if one inspects the internals of these models, they do not show any systematic organization, which also has been a huge problem for understanding how these AI models even work. So that should make us wonder, why is it that the human brain is organized the way it is? And how can we introduce similar organization within AI models? So there's broad consensus that the brain gains a lot from topography. People have shown that topography leads to minimized wiring costs, which is important for the brain to maintain metabolic efficiency. But topography also leads to modularity within the brain, and this has real-world consequences. For example, when people lose function within a small part of the brain because of, say, a stroke or an accident, then not all function is lost. Which means that this implementational wiring constraint has a functional consequence for the brain. So why is the brain organized the way it is? Our central hypothesis is that the organization of the visual cortex emerges by optimizing for representations that solve natural tasks, but under the wiring length constraints inherent to the brain. So the question is, how do we engineer topography in AI models? Over the years, there have been several suggestions for inducing topography either post-training or over the course of model training. We only consider models that induce topography during training, and all of them suffer significant limitations. The main drawback has been the fact that it leads to significant drops in performance, and these algorithms are evaluated on convolutional neural nets only, and it's unclear whether the approach would generalize to other architectures like vision transformers. Also, we don't really know if these approaches would scale to other domains like language and audition. Now, I'll introduce you to a new class of models called TopoNets, which overcomes these limitations and achieves topography like the brain. So I'll structure the rest of the talk into three main questions. How do TopoNets work? How well do they perform? And how well do TopoNets replicate signatures of brain-like organization? Let's start with the first one. So I want to first give you an intuition for something called Turing patterns, and here's the basic idea. Take an image with random pixel values, and I want you to think of them as your typical neural network weights. And now let's blur and sharpen this image. I want you to notice again that there's this distinctive pattern that's emerging here. And now what happens if you repeat this many times? Basically what happens is that the pixels start organizing themselves into Turing patterns, which is something that we see in many places in nature. Then we asked, how do we implement this idea in ANNs now? So To do that, we apply the same exact idea in the weight space of models, because we think of the weights as connections. And the idea is that if the connections or weights are organized, then the emerging features will be organized as well. And we call this loss function topo loss, which basically indicates how organized the weights are within the neural network. Now we can basically add this topo loss term into any training loss during training. Technically, this training loss or task loss could be anything like classification, regression, unsupervised losses, you name it. And this basically now gave us a practical way to test our original hypothesis, because we can now train models that can learn task-relevant representations under some wiring constraints, just like the brain. So you might be wondering, how well do these models work? Here, the x-axis is the degree of topography, where a higher value means that the weights are more topographically organized. And the y-axis is the accuracy of the model on ImageNet, which is a popular way of evaluating neural network models. What is also plotted are the three model architectures that do not have topography. We call these models the baseline models. Notice how these models have high performance but have little to no topography. Now here are the existing topographic models which have high topography, but you'd also notice that the model performance is significantly lower. And this is the problem that I was referring to earlier. So how well do our models trained with topo loss perform? Here they are. And I want you to notice a few things here. First is that our models have significantly higher performance relative to previous approaches, but notice how there is also a trade-off between the performance and the amount of topography, which is sort of expected. Also notice that we have vision transformers, so topo loss can basically generalize even beyond ConvNets. So this is how they perform, but how are TopoNets different from baseline models? We try to inspect that first by using something called the dimensionality of the model representations. So dimensionality has become a popular way of investigating the internal representations of models. The general intuition is that if a model has several independent dimensions, then the effective dimensionality is higher than a model that does not. This pattern is depicted very nicely in this recent study from Mick Bonner's lab. So we now asked how topography might affect model dimensionality. Here again, the x-axis is the degree of topography, and the y-axis is the effective dimensionality of the representations of the model. Notice that all the baseline models are up there to the left and have a significantly high dimensionality. There's also a strong negative correlation across models, which indicates that inducing topography leads to lower dimensional representations. Next, we looked at whether TopoNets predict brain responses better than previous topographic models. Here, we ran several tests to evaluate how TopoNets predict brain responses. I want to show the results from the popular encoding model framework, where the general idea is that there is a linear combination of model features that can be used to predict responses to neurons or voxels in the brain. So we ran evaluation on both monkey data using brain score here on the left, as well as on humans using natural scenes dataset to the right. The x-axis here are the different brain regions on brain score, and the y-axis is the model prediction accuracy. Here, I have the prediction accuracy for the baseline model, and here are the accuracies for our TopoNets as well as TDANS, a previous topographic model. Notice how the model prediction accuracies are higher for TDANS and higher than TDANS and are comparable to baseline models across all brain regions. And we find the same pattern for human data as well, shown here to the right for the ventral temporal cortex. Hence, TopoNets predict brain responses better than previous topographic models and are comparable to baseline. All right, so I've gone through two of the three questions. TopoNets achieve structure in the weight space, and they achieve high performance with low effective dimensionality and can yet predict the neuron and voxel level data with very high accuracy compared to baseline. Note here that we also have vision transformers and ResNet 50s, which are even higher performing and are better predictive models of the brain. Now finally, let's see if TopoNets can replicate signatures of brain-like functional organization. And we start with the V1-like organization, and our strategy here was to just run in silico experiments directly in TopoNets. Here's what this looks like. On the left, we have a specific image like vertical and horizontal gabors that we feed into the model. And on the right-hand side are two cortical maps from the early layers of a TopoNet. Here, the model has not been trained yet, which is why the selectivity has no organization. I'll now play the movie, and you will see how the selectivity develops over the course of model training. So, by the end of training, there is selectivity for these specific orientations compared to other orientations. Now, we can plot the same map showing the preferred orientation for each unit. And this plot is qualitatively similar to the pinwheel maps which have been observed quite extensively in the Monkey V1. So overall, this shows that early orientation selectivity emerges directly within TopoNets. But what about organization of the higher visual cortex? Things like category selective maps. Here again, we adopt the same procedure of running an in silico experiment. We take a category localizer with faces, bodies, scenes, and objects and run these stimuli through TopoNets. We can then plot for each channel the selectivity of a given category against others. And here's what it looks like for face selectivity. Notice that there are specific clusters with high selectivity for faces here. And here are the plots for other categories like bodies and scenes. Notice how the face and the body selective areas are relatively close by and overlapping with some distinct zones, and how the scene selectivity area is further away. And this is also actually what's observed in brains. Thus, clusters corresponding to category selective units emerge automatically within TopoNets. So, we could replicate both pinwheel organization and category selectivity maps. Let's summarize. I've shown you the power of TopoNet models for vision, but what about other domains like language and audition? We wondered if the same principle would generalize and result in brain-like organization even there. So we went ahead and trained language models, GPT-NEOs and nano-GPTs, as well as auditory models called CoQ-DNNs. And this auditory work was led by my friend Heather in collaboration with Janelle Feather, and this paper will be up on arXiv very soon. And we were basically able to successfully train these models, and not just that, we were also able to replicate signatures of brain-like clustering in both these domains. We found evidence for distinct temporal receptive fields for sentences and words in language models, and we replicated both tonotopy as well as music and speech selectivity in auditory models, signatures that we see in the brain. So we can replicate signatures even beyond the visual cortex. So one might ask now, what can we do with these models? Topographic models enable new paradigms for studying vision and cognition more broadly. We can now run neuroscience experiments directly in the AI space and compare the effects against brains. We can do things like microstimulation and suppression experiments, and of course, we can now scale to other tasks and domains. All right, to summarize again, TopoNets across vision, audition, and language provide evidence that brain-like organization emerges naturally when you learn task representations under the right wiring constraints. So yeah, that brings me to the end of my talk. Thanks to everyone at Murthy Lab, and a special call out to my friends and collaborators, especially to Janelle for helping out with the audio models. All of our code and models are open source. Topolaws can be actually added to your PyTorch model with like 2 lines of code. Reach out if you need any help. And with that, I'm going to leave you with my summary slide and take questions.
Okay, we have time for one question.
Really cool talk. So I'm not an expert on these topographic models, but one thing that I seem to remember is that previous models tended to have some kind of a local learning loss, so that basically units were encouraged to group into clusters. Well, here it seems like it's more of a global signal that you're taking these overall Turing patterns and using that as a training. Would you say that this is a good characterization of the difference between?
Well, so TopoNets also are actually a local layer level loss, but we just apply that loss to like all the layers in the model. So other methods mostly are working on the representational space, where they're trying to induce structure explicitly on the representations. But we know that the representations are just functions of the weights themselves. So we decided to just induce structure in the weights. Yeah. So what we basically do is that we just penalize the lack of structure in the weight space, which gives us structured representations.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's thank the speaker again. Thank you.